if the other policies where you have to break some eggs to make an omelet, antitrust is saying it's good to break eggs. It's saying the mere fact that these people are so successful, that's the evidence of the alleged crime.
An idea that antitrust laws are objective, that they can be separated from a political wind or of the moment, a political trend of a moment, is absolutely nonsensical. Across the board, today, big and successful companies in the United States face major antitrust scrutiny and threats ranging from losing some control of their business to being completely broken up. Many major cases active today were started during President Biden's administration's bid to increase aggressive antitrust enforcement, but they continued today under President Trump's second administration. Trump, however, has been recently accused of giving up on his promises to aggressively enforce antitrust laws and of opening the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice for Business for lobbyists to buy a sweeter deal for themselves and companies they represent through backroom dealings with people close to Trump. In today's episode, we discuss the so-called America First antitrust agenda and the merits and weakness of the recent accusations of politicization of antitrust. I'm Robertas Bakula, Associate Fellow at Ayn Rand Institute, and with me is ARI Fellow Ben Bayer.
Hi, Robertas.
So let's start with an overview of what active major antitrust cases we have today in the United States. Most of them started in the last 5 years or so. Google, for example, is facing two major cases. One started still under President Trump's first administration. Second one started in 2023. One is accusing them of monopolizing search markets and another online advertising markets. And in both cases, Google has been accused of being a monopoly and is facing potential breakup of business, like divestiture from Google Chrome or even their ad technology. Then there is an Amazon case where a Federal Trade Commission is accusing Amazon of anti-discounting provisions for sellers and setting up conditions for prime eligibility, which means that sellers on Amazon need to use fulfillment by Amazon to be eligible for prime delivery. And when Apple is facing another case from Department of Justice launched just in March 2024, where Apple is being accused of restricting third-party apps and interoperability, which means integration with other types of devices outside of Apple ecosystem. Trial is pending, and the potential is to compel Apple to lose control or even lose control of their iOS ecosystem that otherwise is very securely protected. Ben, we have commented on all of these three cases in the past. What stance has the Institute taken on each of these?
Yeah, it's you stressed that many of these began under the Biden administration. Some began as far back as the first Trump administration. One of the things that we're going to be talking about today and emphasizing is really the continuity between Biden and Trump policies on antitrust, which should be eye-opening to, I think, a lot of people. But yeah, so ARI has been opposed to antitrust law as such, not just for the last 5 years, but for decades, because Ayn Rand was opposed to it on principle, and we'll talk more about that later. But yeah, just to comment on some of the cases, the recent cases that you mentioned. So the Google search case, you and I commented on that back in September 2024, when it was being carried forward by the Biden administration, even though it was originally initiated under the Trump administration. This was the same time around which we released an open letter to Google the following February about all of the antitrust cases against Google, saying, look, productive companies like Google are real victims of an injustice here. They need to stand up for themselves. You mentioned the Amazon case, and as far back as April 2021, ARI was commenting on this one when Elizabeth Warren was originally calling to break up Amazon because of its various perceived monopolistic behavior forms of behavior. In August 2021, Onkar, Ghate, and I also did a podcast where we analyzed Lina Khan's whole approach to antitrust, her theoretical articles, uh, which the theory of which came to be deemed as "quote unquote" hipster antitrust because it tried to abandon the consumer welfare standard, which had been used for several administrations now in prosecuting these cases. Upshot of which, abandoning that standard means it doesn't really matter whether consumers are benefiting from Amazon's various forms of integration and efficiency. All that matters is they've gained some kind of alleged power that is alleged to be "quote unquote" anti-competitive, which is supposed to be bad, even if it's not actually hurting anybody. And so we took a real sledgehammer to Biden administration's embrace of hipster antitrust early in that administration. And then again, you commented on the Apple case, and that only was initiated toward the end of the Biden administration. But as soon as it did, March 2024, we did another podcast analyzing Merrick Garland's announcement of the case, responding to it by saying, among other things, that look, the fact that Apple is so popular, so many people are fans of its products, and they value the value of these products, the value of the integrated ecosystem that Apple has to offer. This is the thing that makes Apple valuable, and yet that's the chief evidence that Garland is offering for why Apple is a monopoly, quote unquote. So we've had a lot to say about this in the past. We're going to say more today. Robertas, these are just the cases we've commented on in the last 5 years or so. What about the ones that we didn't, that are still ongoing?
Yeah, unfortunately, the less prominent ones, or the companies that don't get as much attention when they're being scrutinized by antitrust. There is, for example, Visa case. The Department of Justice launched in September 2024. Visa is the payment network and controls is not the right word, runs the 60%, almost 60% of debit transactions across the United States, and is being accused of monopolizing that field. Live Nation and Ticketmaster, they're facing a breakup or restructuring to allow more venue and concert producers into the market that supposedly Live Nation and Ticketmaster monopolized. RealPage, the company, is being scrutinized for their algorithm that helps with rent price setting for landlords and companies, allegedly accused of price fixing. So these cases are much less prominent, but they're no less important in terms of what antitrust is trying to do with the businesses that achieve some sort of success and impact in their markets.
I think what all of these cases, both the prominent and the not so prominent ones, have in common with each other is that they're all examples of really successful companies who, because of their productiveness, because of their efficiency, they've secured a large share of their relevant respective markets. And the fact that they're now being targeted for that fact is significant. It has a lot to do with why it is that the Ayn Rand Institute and why Ayn Rand took up a principled stance against these kinds of laws. ARI has a very unique principled moral repudiation of antitrust laws, and that's on the grounds that not only are they really basic violations of economic freedom because they stop businessmen from coming to agreements, exchanging value for value, offering value to their customers who willingly accept those values, but also because it's violating economic freedom for the vilest of possible reason you could ever conceive of. So there's any number of forms of statism where the idea is, we know we're going to restrict some freedom, and it's unfortunate that people are going to have to suffer that, but it's for some greater end. So, for example, any number of forms of redistribution and taxation, it's accepted that, it would be better if we didn't have to take this money from people, but it's needed somewhere else. But you don't even have that kind of veneer of plausibility with antitrust policy, because here it's, if the other policies where you have to break some eggs to make an omelet, antitrust is saying it's good to break eggs. It's saying the mere fact that these people are so successful, that's the evidence of the alleged crime. The evidence that they're being somehow oppressive or tyrannical, even though in fact it is entirely a product of voluntary exchange, something that we'll say more about later in this episode.
Okay, so let's talk about this continuity that you stressed, Ben. So despite some accusations surfacing today, and we will talk about these accusations a little later in the episode, that Trump's administration, second administration, is signaling some real backing off on antitrust persecution or antitrust enforcement, both the election campaign and the administration are actually signaling explicitly talking about increased focus on antitrust and increased aggressive enforcement of antitrust, continuing what has been started both during the Biden and Trump first administration. So President Trump during election campaign has made promises that he will go after the big tech that's running wild. And that's his word, running wild. And he will bring Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple to heel and check their political influence and market power. In one of his posts in Truth Social, where he was announcing an appointment of current leader of the antitrust division at the Department of Justice, he said, quote, "Big tech has run wild for years, stifling competition in our most innovative sector, and as we all know, using its market power to crack down on the rights of so many Americans, as well as those of little tech." And of course, he is supported by Vice President J.D. Vance, who argues that the fact that companies provide benefits or inform, for example, of low prices should not be a path to avoid antitrust scrutiny. He is explicitly anti-Google, and in one of his posts on X platform, he just went outright and said, "Long overdue, but it's time to break Google up." That's coming from the vice president. And new name that replaces Lina Khan, who was leading the Federal Trade Commission under Biden, Andrew Ferguson, explicitly comes out as being loyal to Trump's directives and priorities, and that means tough on big tech. And of course, proof of that is the new case that the FTC has brought against Meta platforms in April 2025. They're looking to blame Meta for acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp and thus monopolizing social networks in some way. And the solution they're looking for is to break that company up and make Meta sell off or somehow divest from those companies. So it's pretty clear from their explicit announcements, at least, and now actions too by the FTC and from President Trump's appointee, Ferguson, that we're seeing aggressive and increased antitrust enforcement as was promised.
And this should not come as any kind of surprise. For one reason, the biggest reason, and it's the reason that in part explains why ARI's position here is so radical in opposing these laws, is that almost everybody's in favor of antitrust laws. On both sides of the aisle, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed by Republicans, even though it's aimed at big business, and you usually think about Democrats being against big business. So it's a long-standing tradition for almost everybody to be in favor of some kind or some form or use of the antitrust laws. The only real debate is only ever about how strictly they should be enforced, what kind of standards they should be used to be enforced, etc. But the other reason to not be surprised by this is that I said we associate anti-big business rhetoric with the Democrats. Well, that was when there was some ostensible difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. But that difference is eroding to the point of almost nothing, especially with the rise of MAGA Republicans, which have really embraced a kind of populism. And J.D. Vance, whom you quoted a moment ago, is the chief representative of this view. He's not just on this topic, more generally, he's been explicit about repudiating the value of free markets, economic freedom. He sees successful businessmen as elites, the enemies of the little guy. He tries to represent himself as a former little guy. That was what Hillbilly Elegy was all about. And that elitism idea that Vance often trades in is a real kind of equivocal kind of package deal, packages together earned success and inherited aristocracy. And that is a similar kind of package deal involved more specifically in the case of antitrust and the way that it's supposed to help prevent uh, anti-competitive tyrants. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But there's a long history of obfuscating and rationalizing antitrust policy with all kinds of pseudo-intellectual justifications. And that's why it's especially useful that another figure in the Trump administration we can talk about and analyze, because she's written theoretically on this, is the Trump administration's new head of antitrust enforcement in the DOJ, Gail Slater.
Right. Slater replaced Jonathan Cantor, and she has 10 years of experience at the FTC, and she was an advisor to Ghate Vance back when he was senator. And she is now at the helm of a division that runs all except one, the cases that we mentioned above at the beginning of the episode, except the Amazon case that's run by FTC. And it's important in her speech in April in 2025 that we'll analyze right now, she establishes first what principles will guide her, or what she calls America First antitrust approach in general. And those three principles, I think, are very revealing. Let's talk about those first. 1, protection of individual liberty from government and corporate tyranny. 2, textualism, originalism, and adherence to precedent. And 3, fear of regulation that stifles competition in a way that, because she thinks that antitrust, quote, is the lowest degree of government control that business can expect. The lowest degree of government control that business can expect. And I think understanding the first really explains a lot and most things about antitrust and what's happening today. Think about this. She explains the first principle of the protection of individual liberty against corporate tyranny. She explains it this way, quote, in free markets, the American people shape the economy toward their own flourishing by starting and growing their own business and through their choices in markets as buyers and sellers. That's what she conceives, what Slater conceives as individual liberty in America. And it's really, what's the real meaning behind a view like that? If you had to translate, what does it mean in reality, and especially in the context of someone who has a force of law behind her, antitrust law, to go after business, it means that if I'm unable to start and succeed in, let's say, online search business, or app distribution business, or ticket sales business, or maybe payment networks business, if I can't succeed in those markets by myself, maybe I can use the government force to move those who have succeeded and have built those markets already out of the way, or maybe even exploit some of the things that they have created for my own benefit, like their networks and their products. I know, Ben, you have a lot to say about this view, but I think that stressing what's the real meaning behind her view of what individual liberty means and what she aims to protecting here is super revealing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think you're totally right about what the way you're unpacking the meaning of this, what its implications are. And something to add to that is that you mentioned the force. She's got the force of law behind her. And from what I understand, the main difference between the FTC versus the Department of Justice with regard to who takes which antitrust cases is that the FTC does civil lawsuits. DOJ files criminal lawsuits. And so when you say the force of law, what you mean is she is charging these companies with a crime. And that is the means by which she is then she is expropriating their resources, their time, their energy on behalf of competitors who could not compete. She's charging them with the crime of being too successful, too competitive. And so what is it that, how is she able to get away with this? How are antitrust laws able to justify treating such people as criminals? Well, the trick is also contained in that first bullet that you mentioned, the idea that what grounds the notion of so-called America First antitrust is protection of individual liberty from government and corporate tyranny. And that's the whole equivocation, that those two are the same thing, that individual liberty means liberty from either kind of tyranny. Now, I think it's unqualifiedly obvious that there is such a thing as government tyranny and that freedom from it is a real and important thing. She's trying to package that together, though, with freedom from so-called corporate tyranny. And you see that in the language that you quoted about how the American people are supposed to be able to shape the economy toward their own flourishing, where what that means, again, is big corporations are tyrannical and stopping Americans from doing that. If they, let's say, for example, are just more competitive and little guys can't compete with them. But that, as you've stressed, is not real freedom. It's a form of legalized theft. The fact that someone's more successful than you doesn't justify your looting them or stopping them from doing whatever they're doing that's successful. They have not stolen anything from you. It wasn't yours to be stolen from in the first place.
Slater also thinks that antitrust as a policy within the United States is going back to the founding, is a conservative principle, conservative policy, and goes back way to the founding of the United States, which was fighting not only against public tyranny, but against private tyranny. And her example of private tyranny is the East India Company. So what Gail Slater is doing is she's removing the distinction, or saying in a sense that there is no distinction between a government-granted monopoly and a private monopoly. Or in other words, the power that a business has acquired in the market through a value production versus a power that has been granted to that business from someone holding political power, whether the king in the past that Americans have fought against or the bureaucrats today. So the only change in her mind is the change of who is the tyrant, right? And whether we call it public or private, but not in effect.
So you mentioned her idea that this is what makes it a conservative policy. And I would cite this as another example of why the term conservative is so meaningless, because it totally depends on what it is in the past that you want to conserve. And surely there are things in the past that, that we've used antitrust law in the past. The Sherman Act was passed. The question that's relevant is, does this law, do these principles represent anything like the founding principles of America, which we think are justified for good philosophical reasons? And the fact that she's trying to somehow relate antitrust law to the British East India Company, which is, of course, the franchise monopoly that was granted by the British government, that only the East India Company was allowed to do trade with the East Indies on behalf of Britain, and they were the only ones allowed by law to sell tea in America. And that's, of course, what the Boston Tea Party was in part protesting. But yeah, that's by law, they were only allowed to do that. That's what a real monopoly is. When government says you are only allowed to trade with such and such person, they're the only ones allowed to do so-and-so business in such and such geographic area. That is real tyranny. That is real use of force, where you pass a law saying, if anybody tries to sell you tea from China, if it's the Dutch, let's say, they'll have to smuggle it, and we'll send out, cutters to intercept the smugglers and put them in jail if they do this criminal deed of trying to sell you tea. Yeah, that is real tyranny. But there's a big difference between that and what it is that the Sherman Act tried to criminalize, what Slater's trying to criminalize now. And interestingly, in that speech that she gives, she even says and admits there's a difference. She says, of course, monopolies at that point in history required the grant of a king protected by his law. And then she says, as you say, Robertas, but the form of our tyrants changed. But they didn't really, because, yes, it's true, people started calling successful business people tyrants, but with no real justification. And they did it by using basically another equivocation, another package deal, where they equate political power with economic power. What successful business people like J. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, one of the first companies that Sherman Act was used against, they achieve their power. They have power. That's true. It's economic power. It's the power to produce. It's the power to create. And it's established by voluntarily persuading someone to buy a product, trading a value for a value. That is a fundamentally, essentially different kind of quote unquote power than the power of the king, the power of the government to punish with force. The oppressive power of kings, what makes them kings, what makes them tyrant, is the fact that they destroy things. They have the power to destroy things through physical force that nobody consents to. That's a big difference from the power to create through voluntary persuasion. So the attempt to package those together and to say somebody's a tyrant because they're good at producing things it's a major logical fallacy, and it's used to evade the fact that what successful business people do when they're trading honestly on a free and open market is fundamentally consistent with American values of freedom and not some kind of tyranny. And just while we're on the topic of the British East India Company, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the other thing about the East India Company that people protested against when they did the Boston Tea Party in 1775 was that maybe it was 73 actually, but was that the East India Company was being exempted from the otherwise mandatory import tariffs that American citizens or American colonists were having to pay on the imports of tea. And yet Slater, of course, is not going to mention that the only one imposing lots of import tariffs and duties on American citizens today is, of course, her own America First administration under President Trump. I will mention one historical parallel that I think she does get right, though the significance of it is not what she intends, is she talks about the historical precedent that led to the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in the 1890s. That was the Granger movement. It was a movement of farmers who protesting the prices of railroad tickets that they needed to ship their grain or crops to market on the grounds that these railroad companies were forming trusts or monopolies. And that's true. That certainly is part of the tradition leading up to the Sherman Act. But I should note that it was, in fact, that action that was eventually then taken against railroads, not just with antitrust law, but with all kinds of other regulatory impositions on the railroad industry, that eventually destroys the railroad industry in America. And it's a big part of the reason why, if you want to take a train anywhere in this country, you have to rely on Amtrak, which is one of the worst forms of most inefficient forms of transportation you can use in this country. And she's saying, let's use the same framework which treated successful business people as quote unquote oppressors to bring them down to size, break them up, make them unsuccessful and inefficient. And she wants to do that for big tech companies. She wants to do that basically for the people who run the internet, the modern information superhighway. She wants to take them and turn them into another version of Amtrak. If that's really what you want, okay, that's not what I want.
I want to pull this thread even further to complete the thread of her trying to obscure the history and the meaning of antitrust. Like we already talked about trying to obscure the distinction between private and public market power and public force, public power, and the distinction between what the founding and the antitrust was, but you just meant it actually against. And there is even more that she's trying to do, and hiding real meaning of antitrust in her view with some nationalist and collectivist slogans that today are pretty popular. So, for example, she says, quote, "Will the American people shape tomorrow's economy, or will others decide what gets made, where it is made, and who makes it?" End quote. And if you take this quote seriously, the only meaning of this question is, does the government get to dictate, or are American businessmen free to make those decisions? When she says American people, does she include the businessmen who are actually making the work of organizing production and looking at the market and making the decisions of what, where, how should be produced and trying to drive that to make a profit, to make the production actually valuable? And when she says, will people shape tomorrow's economy? Well, she means the non-producers. Will non-producers face that economy? So that's the only meaning of that question. The other question that she asks is, we need a statement that she makes more. We need an economy that works for the American people, not the other way around. And the only meaning, again, if you take it seriously, the real meaning of such a statement can be: we need American businessmen who make the decisions and produce stuff to be basically slaves to our wishes, to the American people, so non-producers, as the American people, probably like herself, who will make decisions, who and how should be producing stuff. And we already mentioned this statement above, but I think it's worth stressing, is that when she says that in the free markets, the American people shape the economy toward their own flourishing by starting and growing their own business. We mentioned that phrase, and the only real meaning of that phrase is that, again, if I, one of the American people, am unable to start a business in some market that I wish to be successful in, because there is somebody else who is already successful or more successful, better, maybe more competitive, and it makes it very difficult, then I should be able to use government force to expropriate someone like Google if I want to be in a search market, and use both their data and their model to feed my own business. That's the only meaning of what does it mean for America, for her view that Americans flourishing means being able to start a business. These are major obfuscations of what's the real meaning behind antitrust and her actions as the leader of the antitrust division. Do you agree?
Yes, and who it is that gets to be able to use the force of the government to expropriate from more successful people is then something that's decided by the kinds of nationalistic and collectivistic justifications that you mentioned a few moments ago. That's really important, because I think what the addition of America first to anything these days usually means is we're talking about some kind of protectionism. We're talking about favoring certain American producers over foreign imports or whatever. And it's noteworthy, once again, how exactly does this connect to big tech? Are we suddenly being dominated by foreign IT companies, social media companies? No, in fact, most of our big successful tech companies are homegrown American companies. But so there's no obvious connection. So there's some kind of a sleight of hand being used here. But also, one should note that historically speaking, protectionism on behalf of domestic manufacturers usually works in order to create government franchise or associated cartels rather than to break them down. Because what happens is certain companies are better at lobbying. They're better at lobbying government officials to get breaks from the tariffs, and therefore become a kind of de facto favored class set aside by the government. And you see that happening right now. You see that happening with different companies going to Washington to get exemptions from these tariffs. Trump giving certain kinds of deals to some of them, but not to the other ones that he maybe didn't say nice things about him politically. And that's what happened with the British East India Company. They were a government franchise, first of all, but then which got exemptions from the tariffs the British were otherwise charging on imports of tea. And so if you're concerned about cartels, protectionism is not the way to go.
Okay, so let's Gail Slater. This is the person that we were just describing for the last 10 minutes or so, who inherits the major cases that I listed and above, and including the major case that will probably be resolved very soon against Google in the monopolization of a internet search market. And in the hearings on the remedies for that case, where Judge Mehta will be probably any day now announcing what Google will have to do, from either face some injection on their ability to make contracts with companies like Apple to be a default engine, or even maybe sell Chrome, which is unlikely, but that's on the options that the Department of Justice wants to. And in those hearings, Gail Slater came out and said that in a time of political division in our nation, the case against Google brings everyone together. She saw this antitrust case Google that she inherits and that's been going on since first Trump administration as something that brings everyone together. from the left to the right, both administrations, and the antitrust team, the public who goes anti-Google. It's something that everybody is unified in. Like you, Ben, said already, everybody is pro-antitrust, right? Who there is to stand against that or for a company like Google.
Yeah, it really does bring everyone together in the sense that it unites people on behalf of their very conventional, unthinking dogma. And another example of this where we see more, I think, conventional, unthinking dogma is in the controversy now about whether or not the Trump administration really is aiming to keep its promises about antitrust. And there's been some developments. And Robertas, you've been following these, so can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this is the recent accusations I mentioned, and the accusation is that the Trump administration is politicizing antitrust. And that accusation is pointing out some real problem of backroom deals, but I would say that it's not demonstrating some compromise on the spirit of the America First antitrust. There seems to be more and more people close to Trump dealing and being hired and paid off by the companies who are facing antitrust scrutiny. And the biggest scandal that now made it all public is the scandal about the merger between Hewlett-Packard Enterprise trying to merge with Juniper Networks, and them having a backroom deal that somehow allowed the merger to pass, even though it was challenged by the same Department of Justice in January of this year. As a result of this scandal, 2 deputies who opposed this merger, and they work for Slater, they were fired from the Department of Justice, and now they're publicly accusing some officials of the Department of Justice dealing in the back rooms, just cocktail bars, really, and allowing this merger to go through. Someone like Democrats, like Elizabeth Warren, asked the courts for more disclosure. And Warren and another Senator Klobuchar and Booker are invoking a Tooney Act, passed in 1972, that was supposed to remove lobbying influence from antitrust in response to President Nixon's, another Republican, by the way, administration's corruption in cases like International Telephone and Telegraph. And in that case, Nixon demanded the Department of Justice to waive through the mergers, and suddenly after, the ITT donated $400,000 to the Republican National Convention. So that act that's been pretty dormant until now and not really useful is now, Democrats are now invoking it, and the judge has the ability to review the deal and will be reviewing the deal whether the actual backroom dealings happen.
And it's a somewhat interesting historical footnote that the ITT scandal with Nixon is basically what led to everybody's favorite example of government conspiracy and corruption, the Watergate scandal. So because Democrats got wind of the fact that Nixon accepted this payoff in exchange for letting the ITT merger go through, Nixon was paranoid that the Democrats had dirt on him. And so he wanted to get dirt on the Democrats. And that's why he basically instigated the Watergate break-in. Now, Robertas, the reason that the Democrats are trying to invoke this law is because they say that the Trump administration, just like the Nixon administration, is not objectively enforcing the antitrust laws that are on the books, that rather than enforcing them through the rule of law, they are going with backroom deals. How do you respond to that accusation? Is it maybe really the case that the Trump administration is just not as serious about antitrust law as it said?
Right. It's an interesting one. So Senator Klobuchar reacted to this whole ordeal, saying that the Antitrust Division has long worked to enforce the law to fight monopoly power. Enforce the law. As if the monopoly power is something that can be objectively defined. And we already started discussing this a little bit before. And you said that the rational meaning of monopoly power is the only real meaning is when a government grants a business, let's say something like an airline, an exclusive privilege to operate in some industry. And Slater mentioned the new East India Company, that it was granted an exclusive privilege and sealed that business from competition, legally prohibited other companies from entering the field. Well, quite obviously that in all these cases that we discussed today, from every merger and all the cases that are active now in antitrust, none of those companies facing this antitrust scrutiny today have been granted such privilege. And in an important way, an idea that antitrust laws are objective, that they can be separated from a political wind or of the moment, a political trend of the moment, is absolutely nonsensical. If you think about it, if politicians, if bureaucrats, or courts, regardless of who is making the decision, they get to decide which deal is pro-competitive and which one is anti-competitive, what increases or reduces some form of social common welfare, consumer welfare, what can be considered pro-consumer or anti-consumer. Is it, for example, a bigger company is better for pro-consumer or multiple small ones? And in which situation, which is the right answer? What market share is enough? And what market share is just a little too much? How to define a market in the first place? Is Apple a competitor with Google, for example, on app distributions? Or Android is a market in itself and we can ignore Apple, which is exactly what's happening, by the way, in some private antitrust cases now between that Google is facing as well. Which industries are essential and which are not? When does a company simply succeed and when it has intent to monopolize? A phrase like that. It achieves success not from some innovation, just innovation, but from actions that were directly targeted to achieve marketplace and maybe make it difficult for competitors to enter. So with all these questions, and all of these are just a sample of questions that have to be answered in each individual antitrust case in front of a judge, in opinions of hundreds that go for hundreds of pages with thousands of exhibits. If all these questions have to be answered by a court or a politician or a bureaucrat, there is no such thing as avoiding a political or ideological view influencing antitrust enforcements and rules. And of course, historically, that's pretty obvious, because the antitrust enforcement always went hand in hand with a political wind. So from aggressive, very aggressive antitrust enforcement and trust busting during the progressive era in the early 20th century, where Teddy Roosevelt made his name as trust buster, to then suspension of antitrust laws during the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who thought that the antitrust laws were not really useful for him for his New Deal agenda, where he actually wanted companies to work together and set prices rather than compete and drive prices down. He wanted prices to stay up, because that's another topic why he thought he needed that. And then after that failed, there was a revival of antitrust again to blame businesses for the Great Depression and blame them for how long and how difficult the recovery is. And now we will go after and prevent any merger that of companies that would become controlling 5 to 7% of the market sometimes, which is minuscule in some sense. They would prevent even those in the 60s, 50s. And today we're back to a techlash moment where we're looking at the progressive era and saying just the bigness of a company is something that's instead of effect on let's say a consumer that's been the standard up until now just the bigness is something to be is enough to go after them. So the point is that an accusation that we're getting now, antitrust is getting politicized instead of left for objective law enforcement, falls completely flat if you understand what antitrust is and what kind of decisions have to go into it, and that they cannot avoid political or ideological views on each of those questions.
Yeah, and the real issue here is that you can argue that there is corruption in the enforcement or non-enforcement of antitrust law only if you think there's an actually objective way to do it, a way that's actually consistent with, coherent with the rule of law. And the essence of what we're saying here is that there just isn't. There is just no objective way to decide what any of the key terms that you just mentioned and talked about, Robertas, actually mean. And there's therefore no way for a company to know in advance if they are violating these laws or not. Give an example. You mentioned the example of Apple and app distribution, and that there are certain cases now against Apple, and the accusations they're making are the reason that Apple is a monopolist is not because it's been given some franchise by the government to be the only tech company, which is, of course, obviously not true, but because, well, they're excluding competitors from some relevant marketplace. How so? Well, because Apple has an app store, and there are certain terms and conditions on the app store that stop you from linking to other app stores and other platforms like Google Play. Well, yes, if you arbitrarily define the relevant market from which people are excluded as Apple's own app store, then yes, it is excluding competitors from its own store. But of course, that's not a reasonable definition of a market. You can slice and dice markets any which way you like. You could also say, well, what about just the fact that Google has its own app store on a different platform? Why isn't that a competitor? Well, because they're different platforms. So there's no objective way of deciding this, except arbitrary fiat and stipulation. You fiat that this is the market, and therefore you get to decide they're excluding people from it, even though, of course, everybody who's actually participating in the market, everybody who's buying, is consenting to be there, consenting to abide by the terms and conditions. So as long as you can never objectively define these terms, and it's always going to depend on these kinds of arbitrary fiat selection of a market, et cetera, and various other non-objective terms, you're always going to have some kind of discretion involved in how these sorts of laws get executed. And that's where the corruption comes in. When Ayn Rand was writing in the early 1960s on a different topic, on the issue of foreign aid, she made a point that was very similar to what I think she would have agreed applies also to antitrust laws. And because the foreign aid laws have something important in common with antitrust laws, which is they have this same kind of non-objective language with regard to key provisions. And with foreign aid laws, it's that the foreign aid should be distributed for the sake of the public good. And then there's the question of who is it that's the foreign aid money is going to be distributed to, because usually it's distributed to somebody who lobbies for it in the domestic market, because somebody has to actually fulfill the contracts that are distributed abroad. And here's what she wrote about foreign aid, which I think applies equally well to the questions about antitrust. She said, the worst aspect of it is not that such a power can be used dishonestly, but that it cannot be used honestly. The wisest man in the world with the purest integrity cannot find a criterion for the just, equitable, rational application of an unjust, inequitable, irrational principle. The best that an honest official can do is to accept no material bribe for his arbitrary decision, but this does not make his decision and its consequences more just or less calamitous. A man of clear-cut convictions is impervious to anyone's influence, but when clear-cut convictions are impossible, personal influences take over. When a man's mind is trapped in the foggy labyrinth of the non-objective, that has no exits and no solutions. He will welcome any quasi-persuasive, semi-plausible argument. Lacking certainty, he will follow anyone's facsimile thereof. He is the natural prey of social manipulators, of propaganda salesmen, of lobbyists. And so, it may well be that the Trump administration is accepting material bribes for its decisions to not pursue antitrust lawsuits against certain companies versus against others, which is certainly a kind of corruption. I'm not trying to justify it by any means, but the broader point here is that when other administrations enforce antitrust laws, it's not like they are doing it in an objective way either. They are probably relying on social manipulators, propaganda salesmen, and lobbyists of various kinds to determine using semi-plausible issues of personal favor to decide who are the people who are allegedly anti-competitive, which are the markets that they are allegedly excluding people from. And so, Epic Games, to the extent that it's influenced somebody, and I guess the California government to sue Apple, is relying on these kinds of, maybe not at a cocktail party kind of backroom deals that apparently happened with the Trump administration, but the equivalent of that in some kind of academic seminar room or boardroom.
Right. And the difference that it's a cocktail party in the boardroom, or is it some other way of ideological political influence on antitrust, doesn't really make a difference to the fact that, yes, antitrust is influenced by whoever is running the departments and is in power to determine what kind of cases will be brought and what kind of cases can we just let go and maybe not enforce for some reason or another. And it's quite, I would say, beyond hypocritical to sort of accuse the today's situation of politicization. The simple reason for the accusation is that it's not your team that's actually that's winning or driving the seat. Lobbying, again, like you were stressing, it's an inherent issue and an avoidable issue in the mixed economy. And it's absurd to think that when you introduce a mix of controls of non-objective laws where somebody like a bureaucrat at department or even the president can decide and threaten companies, the businesses in their free in a process of production to from just completely breaking them up to directing their work to, let's say, national factories instead of international foreign factories, whatever the business decision is. If you allow that power to the government, then lobbying and trying to protect yourself is unavoidable. And that's, again, something that Ayn Rand noticed and explicitly demonstrated. She said that lobbying is the activity of attempting to influence legislation by privately influencing the legislators. It is the result of creation of a mixed economy, of government by pressure groups. Its methods range from mere social courtesies and cocktail party or luncheon friendships to favors, threats, bribes, and blackmail. And in another essay, she said that while a mixed economy preserves the semblance of an organized society, and that's the semblance, for example, that Gail Slater thinks that antitrust is a set of laws, is a set of rules that we can follow and objectively enforce. A mixed economy preserves the semblance of an organized society, but it breaks up a country into an ever-growing number of enemy camps, into economic groups fighting one another for self-preservation in an indeterminate mixture of defense and offense. And lobbying, you can think that preventative lobbying is the offense that we have to engage in.
Yeah, I think what all of this adds up to, if that kind of world concerns you, a world where we have a kind of civil war, a kind of cold civil war among different interest groups, each lobbying for power against each other, where it eventually becomes difficult to determine who's engaging in self-defense and who's engaging in offense. If you're concerned with money and politics, as people often put it, the solution is to take the politics out of money. That is to say, take government regulation out of the economy, because it's that power government has to sacrifice one group to another that incentivizes people to either lobby for self-defense or to go on the offense against the other group that they're worried they might get sacrificed for. And I should say, it's often hard to tell the difference. Who's engaging in self-defense, who's going on the offense, given how much of this happens behind back doors, and given how many different ways government and its power are involved in the economy. And the idea can't be that businessmen should just never at all have anything to do with anything government does, should never lobby, etc., because they do have the right to self-defense. If somebody's offering them some kind of deal, whether it's in a back room or not, and you have a reason to think that it might save your business from going under, they might justifiably need to take it, even though it's a crook, in this case, the government that's offering it to you. That's really important. That being said, it's also true that when we're talking about corporations that are very successful, that have, a bankroll that they can sit on, it is sad that not more of them decide to use their resources, to use not only their financial resources, but their popular sway. I mean, Apple, for example, has a huge fan base. It is unfortunate that they don't use their resources, their voice, to take a stand for themselves, to say, rather than in Tim Cook's case, bringing a gold-plated Apple medallion to the White House because of his worry about what the Trump administration might do against that antitrust case, rather than doing that, basically giving bribes or other kinds of favors to the administration, like saying we're going to make sure we have so many jobs in Kentucky with Corning to make glass for iPhones. Rather than doing that, why don't they stand up for themselves and say, you don't have the right to impose these penalties with tariffs, with antitrust laws, with other kinds of regulations against us in the first place? We're going to fight these laws. It is possible to fight them in court. It is possible to say these antitrust laws, even though they're supported by the Sherman Antitrust Act, are in many ways hopelessly non-objective and vague, and that nobody can possibly be subject to them, and that they should be voided for vagueness, which is a real kind of doctrine in contemporary jurisprudence. So that is what more of these companies should be doing it. And if they won't do it, if they're too afraid to do it, somebody needs to do it for them. Somebody needs to stand up for them if they recognize the value that these companies produce. That is, of course, in part what we're doing right now. And we're hoping that more people will stand up with us. Because what the discussion of the antitrust laws really brings out is that what's so wrong about them is the ultimate expression of, it's the condensed essence of what's generally wrong with infringement on economic freedom and regulations of business. That they're just the most overt expression of the idea that so many of them are really motivated by hatred of ability, hatred of success. That's what drives hatred of capitalism, skepticism about capitalism more generally. That's what justifies so many other kinds of regulations, the idea that business people are these would-be tyrants who need to be restrained in advance, when it's not true that when they're left free, predominantly what business people do if they want to succeed is to be innovative value creators who create values for the rest of us by trading with us, and thereby lift us out of poverty and create the whole civilized industrial technological world that we see around us. And that's something that we should be grateful for. And if America First means anything, which it usually doesn't these days, what it should mean is defending the actual founding values of America, which includes, very importantly, the right to the pursuit of happiness and therefore the right to the pursuit of profit through market success and through earned ability.
And for those who are up for a challenge to stand up for business, I would like to leave you with some sources that can help with that. And we mentioned some of them through the episode, but not all. So, for example, Ayn Rand has a very powerful essay where she calls big business America's persecuted minority. Onkar, Ghate, and Don Watkins have just released a new book, Profit Without Apology: The Need to Stand Up for Business, which is exactly on the point that you were just making, Ben, at the end. Myself, Onkar, Ghate, Elan Jorna, and Todd Svaney, we have written an open letter to Google's CEO, Sundar Pichai, and his team, explicitly telling them that we stand for Google in the search and other cases that we're facing, and they should stand too, and they should recognize that what they're being attacked for is not some actual misconduct and misdoing, but a real virtue of theirs, the real productive virtue. And Marek Michulka wrote an article about Google as well, showing the value that Google has created, called Antitrust Criminalizes Google's Productive Virtue. These are just a few, but that's a good start if you want some material about why and how business should be defended.
And just a couple of comments on some of those sources. So Marek's article, one of the good things about it, it goes into detail just why it is that this antitrust case against Google is really punishing it for its success, and demonstrates the real innovation that Google has been responsible for, which is now being attacked. And he does it really with lots of really good concrete examples. The book by Onkar and Don, The Profit Without Apology, that is the manifesto of the Atlas Circle project here at the Ayn Rand Institute, where we are encouraging business people to stand up for themselves and trying to give them intellectual resources like this podcast for the sake of doing that. And then the Ayn Rand piece that you mentioned, America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business, that is the major essay where she also stakes her major claims against antitrust law, illustrating with a number of historical cases from the mid-20th century, why these laws are so unjust and should be repealed.
Okay, so before you go on to read all of these, please subscribe, comment, and share this episode on YouTube and Facebook. And if you have any questions or comments, please send them to newideal@aynrand.org. Thank you, Ben.